Just after midnight, on the 6th of January 1969, the night sleeper from Edinburgh to London was brought to a halt in the freezing dark by a village. At the little border town of Newcastleton, the people had had enough. They had locked the level crossing gates against the train and stood on the line in the bitter cold. Old men, mothers, children, refusing to let it pass. At their head was the parish minister, and when the police moved in and arrested him on the tracks of his own village, the crowd did not scatter. They sang. They held that train for hours, but they could not hold back what was coming, because that sleeper was the very last train ever to run the length of the Waverley Route, 98 miles of railway through the wildest, loveliest country in southern Scotland. By the time the sun came up over the border hills, the most beautiful main line Britain ever built was dead, and this time there would be no bringing it back. To understand why a whole village would lie down in front of a train to save it, you first have to understand what the Waverley Route was. It ran for 98 miles from Edinburgh in the north down through the rolling hills of the borders, across some of the emptiest and most haunting country in all of Britain, to the city of Carlisle on the English side. It was a main line, not a humble branch, but a great trunk route, and it was, by the common agreement of everyone who ever rode it, breathtaking. It was finished in 1862, driven through that difficult landscape by an army of laborers called navvies, armed with little more than picks, barrows, and black powder. They blasted cuttings out of solid rock and threw embankments across boggy moorland, working through border winters that would stop a modern machine dead. Some of them died in the doing of it and were buried in the little kirkyards along the route, their names long since worn from the stones. They named the finished line after the Waverley novels of Sir Walter Scott, whose great house at Abbotsford stood beside the railway near Melrose. For this was Scott's country, the very landscape of ballads, border raids, and old, sad songs. The railway took that romance and made it iron, and to ride it was to take one of the great journeys in all of Britain. Out of Edinburgh, the line climbed steadily, following the Gala water up into the hills, the houses thinning until there was nothing but heather and sheep and sky. It crested high, bleak summits where the snow fences stood like the bones of some great animal, then dropped down into the lonely valley of Liddesdale, past Newcastleton, and on towards the English border and Carlisle. There were stations in that emptiness so remote that the snow could cut them off for days, and the station master and his family were the only souls for miles. It was, quite simply, magnificent, a working main line that ran clean through a wilderness, and what engineering it was. The line soared across deep valleys on viaducts like Shankend, great curving spans of stone arches carrying the rails high over empty moorland. It bored through the hills at Whitrope, a tunnel in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest house, where the air turned cold and the dark closed in. To stand on a Waverley platform in winter was to feel you were at the very edge of the inhabited world, and yet the trains came through, day and night, linking these far places to Edinburgh, to Carlisle, to London, to everywhere, and the line had a purpose far beyond its beauty. The borders were mill country. The towns strung along the route, Galashiels, Hawick, Melrose, wove the tweed and the knitwear that the world bought. The railway carried the raw wool in and the finished cloth out. It carried the mill workers and the market traders, the rugby teams and the school children. For the people of the borders, the Waverley was not a luxury. It was the thread that tied them to the rest of the country. Hawick, the largest of the border towns, lived by that line. You could board a train there and step off in the heart of Edinburgh in time for lunch, or wake the next morning in London. The whole town's sense of itself, of being connected, of mattering, ran along those rails. Which is why, when London decided the rails had to go, the borders did not simply mourn, they fought. But to call the Waverley a main line is to miss what it truly was. For the people strung out along those 98 miles, it was simply the way life was lived. It began before dawn, with the milk and the mails, the first train carrying the churns from the border farms, and the morning post that tied these remote valleys to the rest of the world. By breakfast, the mill workers were aboard, riding into the great tweed and knitwear mills of Hawick and Galashiels that clothed half the world. Mid-morning brought the shoppers and the market traders. The afternoon brought the school children, who, in many a border family, were the first generation to ride a train daily to a bigger school in a bigger town, and to dream of a bigger life because of it. And the line carried the great occasions, too. It ran the rugby specials when Hawick or Galashiels played away, whole towns traveling together, singing the old songs. It carried brides in white, and in its time, it carried the dead to their rest. It brought the soldier home on leave, and too often, it brought him home for the last time under a flag. Every life in the Borders, from the cradle to the kirkyard, had the rhythm of that railway running quietly beneath it. And in winter, the line showed its true character, and so did the men who ran it. When the blizzards came down on the high summits and buried the cutting at Whitrope under drifts taller than a man, the railwaymen turned out in the dark, with shovels and plows and sheer stubbornness to keep the road open. They knew that for the villages beyond, the train was not a convenience. It was the difference between being connected to the world and being cut off entirely. They kept the Waverley running through storms that closed every road for miles around. It was a point of pride. The line did not stop. Think of how many lives leaned on it without ever once thinking about it. The doctor who reached his outlying patients by train. The young woman who took it each morning to the only office job for 30 miles. The boy who pressed his face to the window every evening to watch the express thunder through and felt the platform tremble beneath his feet. The railway was the great fact of their world, as permanent as the hills it ran through, as reliable as the seasons. This was the thing the men with the pencils never saw. On their page, the Waverley was a length of loss-making track through empty country. In truth, it was the spine of a whole society, and you cannot read a spine off a balance sheet. The Waverley Route was condemned, like so much else in that decade, by the cold arithmetic of the 1960s. On the great ledger of British railways, this long, lonely, expensive line through thinly peopled country was a loss maker. The viaducts cost money to maintain, the summits had to be kept clear of snow, and the towns it served, for all their pride, were small. To the men with the pencils in London, it was obvious. 100 miles of heavily engineered railway, serving a scattering of border towns. The numbers did not work. The line must close. And here is what made the wound of the Waverley cut deeper than almost any other. By the time the axe finally fell on it, Dr. Beeching himself was long gone, sent back to his chemical company years before. The great wave of closures was supposed to be over. The country had begun, dimly, to sense that it had cut too far. And yet still, in 1969, the government reached out and severed this one last great line, against the furious objections of everyone it served. It felt less like arithmetic now, and more like spite, a system finishing a job out of sheer momentum, long after the reasoning behind it had curdled. But the Borders understood, as the accountants never did, exactly what closure would mean. This was not a city, where another line ran a mile away. The Waverley was the only railway for a vast area. Take it away, and you would not inconvenience the Borders, you would isolate them. You would strand an entire region of Scotland on the wrong side of a closed door, and they warned of it, loudly and clearly. They petitioned in their thousands. They sent deputations to London. They filled the local papers with the reasoned, patient case that closing this line would not save money in the end. It would simply transfer the cost from a railway account in Edinburgh to the slow ruin of a whole region. They pointed out that Hawick would become one of the furthest towns from a railway station in the entire country. They were told, in the language of the age, that the buses would cope, that the roads were the future. That sentiment could not be allowed to stand in the way of progress. They had even been given hope. There had been words from men in power suggesting the line might be spared, that the Borders case had been heard. And then the words came to nothing, as words so often did in those years, and the closure went ahead anyway. So the date was set. The Waverley would close in the first week of January 1969, in the dead of a border winter, when the hills were white and the nights were at their longest. It is hard not to feel that even the timing was a kind of cruelty, but the people of the Borders had one night left, and they were not going to let their railway die quietly. The last day was the 5th of January 1969. All along the line, people came out to say goodbye. The final trains ran heavy and slow, every window crowded with faces. At the lonely halts in the hills, where ordinarily a single passenger might wait, there were knots of people standing in the snow simply to watch the last train pass, and to wave and to weep. All day the protests had grown. At Galashiels and at Hawick, the platforms were black with people. Wreaths were laid on the buffers. School children were let out to see the last of the line their parents and grandparents had ridden all their lives. There was singing, and there was anger, and beneath it, the dawning, disbelieving grief of people watching something permanent be taken from them in a single afternoon. That night, the very last train to travel the whole length of the route was the Edinburgh to London sleeper. It set out into the darkness, gathering the line's final hours behind it as it went. And as it came south through the Borders towards England, it ran into the town of Newcastleton and into history. The people of Newcastleton had decided they would would not let the last train through without a reckoning. They closed the level crossing gates against it. They came out of their houses in the freezing cold, and they stood on the line. Hundreds of them, the whole town, it seemed, blocking the way south. At their head stood their parish minister, a man who believed that what was being done to his community was simply wrong, and who was prepared to stand on the tracks and say so. The train stopped. The police were called. And in a scene that those who saw it never forgot, the minister of Newcastleton was arrested on the railway line of his own parish, in the middle of the night, for the crime of trying to save it. The crowd did not break. They stood firm, and they sang, and they held that train in the freezing dark for the better part of an hour. In the end, of course, the law prevailed. A clergyman who happened to be aboard the train interceded. The minister was released. The gates were opened, and slowly, reluctantly, the last sleeper pulled away into England, its red tail lamp dwindling down the valley until the darkness swallowed it whole. When it was gone, the people of Newcastleton walked home through the snow. Behind them, the rails were already, in every way that mattered, dead. They had not saved their railway, but they had refused, gloriously, defiantly refused, to let it go without a fight, and history has remembered them for it ever since. The morning after was the strangest of all. For more than a century, there had been a rhythm to these towns. The first train before dawn, the whistle echoing off the hills, the timetable that ordered the day as surely as the church bell. And on that January morning, it was simply gone. The signals stood frozen at danger over rails that no train would ever trouble again. In the station houses up and down the line, men who had given their working lives to the railway woke to the first morning in 40 years with nowhere to go and nothing to keep. The whole route seemed to hold its breath, and it never let it out. Then came the destruction. Because, as with so many of the closures of that era, it was not enough merely to stop the trains. The track was lifted and sold for scrap. The stations were boarded, then sold, then in places pulled down. The great viaducts were left to stand empty in the hills, magnificent and useless, carrying nothing across the valleys but the wind. The route that had taken an army of men a decade to build was unpicked mile by mile until you could walk its whole length and never once hear a train. And Hawick, proud Hawick, the mill town that had lived by the line, became exactly what its people had been promised it would not. One of the most remote towns from a railway in all of Britain. To reach a train now meant a long, slow journey by road, over the hills in all weathers. The young began to drift away. The connection that had made the town feel part of something larger was simply gone, and the boarders settled into a quiet that lasted for the rest of the century. They paid for it, year after year, in a slow leak of life. Without the railway, the mill towns found it harder to trade, harder to attract new work, harder to hold on to their young people, who left for Edinburgh and Glasgow and did not come back. The closure did not kill the boarders overnight. It did something quieter and crueler. It made them smaller and more distant and easier to forget. And yet, the Waverley was never quite allowed to die in people's hearts. For nearly 50 years, it existed as a ghost, a green scar across the borders, beloved of walkers and railwaymen, photographed and mourned and remembered. A band of enthusiasts gathered high on the old summit at Whitrope and, slowly, lovingly, began to bring a fragment of it back to life. A length of track, a restored building, a place to stand and remember. Old station houses up and down the line became cherished homes, their owners keeping the platforms swept out of something like reverence. People wrote books about it. They never quite forgave what had been done. For a whole generation across Scotland, the Waverley became the very symbol of the folly of the axe, the most beautiful thing the country had ever thrown away. And quietly, stubbornly, the campaign to bring it back refused to die. And then, against all expectation, something happened that almost never happens to a closed railway. A piece of it came back from the dead. In September 2015, 46 years after that last sleeper crept away from Newcastleton, trains returned to the borders. The northern third of the old Waverley Route, some 30 miles from Edinburgh down to Tweedbank near Melrose, was rebuilt and reopened at a cost of close to £300 million. They called it the Borders Railway, and the people who had been told their line would never be missed proved the accountants wrong all over again. For the new trains carried far more passengers than anyone had dared to forecast. Towns that had been cut off for half a century were connected once more. Grandparents wrote it who remembered, as children, the day the old line died. But here is the ache at the heart of it. The trains came back only as far as Tweedbank. Beyond that, the line still stops. The wildest, loveliest miles, over the summits, through Whitrope Tunnel, across Shankend Viaduct, down through Newcastleton and on to Carlisle, still lie silent. Hawick, the town that fought hardest, still waits. The most beautiful part of the most beautiful railway Britain ever built is still a ghost. The people of Newcastleton understood something, that freezing night in 1969, that the men with the pencils never did. That a railway is not just a line on a balance sheet. It is the proof that a place matters, that no matter how far out in the hills you live, the world has not forgotten you. They lost their fight, but they were right. And somewhere up on the border summits tonight, on a viaduct that leads from nowhere to nowhere, the ghost of the Waverley Route is still waiting, patient and beautiful and silent, for a train that has never come back. This has been Forgotten Railways. If you remember the Waverley, or any line like it, tell us its name in the comments. We read every one. And subscribe so that these lines are not forgotten twice.